So in this video I'm going to show a new form of architecture that as a timeless way of architecture can overcome the current situation and by that also modernity. So modern architecture has failed, right? And everyone kind of knows it. So we have on the one hand these boring boxes that kind of nobody likes, that follow that tale or the story of the early modernism or Bauhaus architecture. I made another video about that. And then on the other hand, we have these fancy star icon architecture like Frank Gehry here or Zaha Hadid here that I think give people just something to talk about, but they are quite shallow and quite nonsensical, so which I also explained in the previous video. So what can we do then instead? I think we cannot just go back to the previous pre-modern time because going back is not a story. So people always talk, okay, then we build just like pre-modern architecture, but I think this is not a solution for the future. So what we do then? I mean, in this video, I try to look at what I call the timeless elements of architecture that I see like the grammar within a language or the vocabulary. So every language has grammar and vocabulary, right? And that makes it just useful and understandable. So in this video, I try to make a suggestion what these timeless elements of architecture are, like a grammar in a language that existed throughout all styles. So I structured this video in two parts. The first I called the self-understanding, so kind of the mindset of this new form of architecture. And the second part is what I think what these timeless elements of architecture are. So let's start with the mindset. The first part I called evolution instead of revolution. So when we look at that beautiful nature picture, like a symbol, I mean, nature evolves, right? Nature doesn't radically change and throw away everything and eradicate its whole history and start new from scratch. So everything evolves, and nature also doesn't go back in past and restore a previous state, and nature also does not stay the same. So nature evolves in its own pace, right? So when we look at that picture, that symbolizes like modern architecture, right? Modern architects, especially in the 1910s and 20s, they wanted to eradicate everything and wanted to eradicate the past because they just thought like, okay, these people were like stupid, they just didn't know it better. So they wanted to start everything from scratch, just with ratio and logic, right? But as I said before, nature doesn't work like that. So I think we should see the history as our history. I mean, we are part of it. We derived out of our own history. So I think we should like see ourselves as part of that and see how we can develop or evolve our history to something new, something that fits our time, something contemporary. But as I said, without like throwing away all our past. So what are these timeless elements of architecture? I mean, it's due to interpretation. So in this video, I give a suggestion what that can be. And the second chapter I call The City as a Society of Houses, and I subtitle it with Responsibility instead of Egomania. So when you look at that building from Liebeskind that cuts into that old building, I mean, what does that building want to tell us? I mean, on the one hand, these like icon star architects, they tell us something. Now we have like internet and 3G and 4G, and now we cannot build straight walls anymore. I mean, I think society have changed over the past, but on the other hand, not that much. I mean, humans still have the same body and physiognomy as 2000 years ago, and we also still have the same needs. So, and on the other hand, these fancy buildings like this art museum in Graz in Austria, I mean, these buildings doesn't look left or right? So they are just about themselves. That's why I said they're egomaniac. So these buildings just tell a story about themselves. So maybe about the maybe or maybe not existing genius of the architect, but it's only about itself. It's totally self-centered and egomaniac, right? So I think a building should be about the purpose of the building. It has to serve the purpose, and it has to serve the people who look at that every day and who use it. So architecture is kind of a public matter, right? It concerns everyone. So I think these buildings should not just be about themselves. They have to serve the public and they have to serve the people. And I think they all should look left and right. And as I said, if we think of the city as a society of houses, like this art museum in Vienna, I mean, in Graz in Austria, it doesn't care about its surrounding at all, right? It's totally selfish and self-centered. So when we look at that beautiful city in Italy instead, I mean, every house has its own character and its own face, but still they all like match together. As I said, as houses, as a part of a society. So when we see the city as a society, there are certain things that you do not do in public, right? Public behavior also includes certain manners. So if we follow like certain manners, everyone can still have a unique character and be individual, right? Like unique individuals. But on the other hand, we will still be more social. So the next point, individual character, I mentioned already. So when you look at that house from Christian Friedrich Hansen, I mean, it has a very strong character. It's a very quite strict classicism from around 1800 in Hamburg, but still it has a very unique face and its own character, so you will not forget that. But still it follows all the rules and patterns of classical architecture that I will lay out in that video. Or this like Petit Trianon in Versailles. I mean, I don't say we should build exactly like that, right? But in this video, in the second part, I will try to work out what these elements are that I call like timeless elements of architecture. So this building also has a unique face and character, right? And it's also same as the previous one, like quite pure classicism. So, and then on the other hand, modern architecture always talked about functionality, right? And function, but actually they forgot that beauty and also like monumentality are also functions. So when we look at that Egyptian temple, I put that here because I love Egyptian architecture so much. So when you look at that, it gives you the feeling of monumentality, right? Or sublimeness, like in this hall, like in this building, or when we look at that very simple staircase from Aldo Rossi from 1970s, it's quite pure, but it gives you a feeling that I would call like sublimeness, right? So the feeling of experiencing monumentality or sublimeness, they also function, right? So emotions also have a function. Humans are not just a brain and ratio. So I think like early modern architecture forgot about that beauty and also like monumentality and sublimeness are actually functions of architecture. The next point I call being definite instead of ambiguous. So modern architecture always wanted to be like fluid and indefinite and ambiguous. So it kind of often wanted to ask questions and want to challenge the viewer. I think that's not the task of an architect. So what we see here is the Museum of Schinkel, right, in Berlin. So modern architecture often wanted to challenge the viewer, right? But I think it's not the task of an architect to challenge the visitor, ask him like difficult questions about the world or about himself. So it's not the job of an architect to interrupt or ask questions, or also not to educate the public. I mean, early modern architecture often wanted to educate people, right? I think it's the job of a building or an architecture to give answers. I mean, to fulfill the purpose and to serve. So building has to be serving. It should not be about the architect and about the genius of the architect. It should be about the purpose of the building and the people who use it every day. And as I said before, of the city. So the architecture has to serve the people and the city around it that it stands in. So the next point related to that I call being harmonic instead of disturbing. So I mentioned that before already. When you look at that building from Palladio, in Italy, this famous hall. So it's again like it's a public building, but it's like it has a very unique face and it's perceived as beautiful, right? Because even when it's very individualistic, it still follows harmonic proportions and harmonic design. So when you remember that Liebeskind building from before, it wants to interrupt and disturb and ask questions. And by that, it's only about itself and it's maybe or not so maybe great message that it wants to survey to the people. But it's actually not, as I said, it's not the task of a building to interrupt or ask questions. So that's why I said we should be harmonic instead of disturbing. So by using like pleasing proportions and design. So this building still pleases the eye, right? And so a building has to be serving and also pleasing and not like interrupting and disturbing. So I think it's like about the self-understanding of the architecture, right? It comes down to the point what I said, it has to serve and not to talk about itself. Related to that is also the point of timelessness. I mean, it's a bit ridiculous that I have to mention that at all. When we look at that building of Jean-Étienne Boulet, the only existing one from him, that one follows strict classicism. And as I said, again, we should not build exactly like that. But that's like more than 200 years old, and it conveys the feeling of beauty, and as I said before, kind of also monumentality. So it follows all these functions of classical architecture that like have the same systems, which I try to talk about in this video, throughout centuries, throughout all styles. So that means it's also like timeless. And I think it's about the hierarchy of values. Like contemporary architects, they often want to be like contemporary and expressing our current time and being like innovative. I mean, being innovative is one thing, but I think we should value timelessness higher than being innovative. So it's about the hierarchy of values, right? And also we should like display our current time, right? But I think for many contemporary architects, it's often like the current 5 or 6 years. But I think it can be also this century or the current 200 years we are living in. So I think we should just like value timelessness higher than being innovative or new. And by statistics, every building stands like 50 or 60 years at least. So I think every design decision an architect makes, he has to ask himself, will this building be still pleasing for the eyes, pleasing for these people, and serving the purpose in 20, 40, or 50 years? So the next point is like local context. So this is the same city in Italy as before. And to be fair, this point came into discussion already like since 1970, so since the early postmodern movement. So I think currently architects look more at the local contents in many cases already. So it's in the public architecture discussion already a while. The early modern architects didn't care about the surrounding of the building, and even in the 1960s they toned down like still very well intact like pre-modern buildings because they didn't see a value in that. But this has become better already since the 1970s. But I still put that point in here because it's an important thing that we should look about, as I said, look a bit around us and not just think and talk about itself. And also we should not have the arrogance to think that now me as an architect or our current architecture society is better than all the past and can do it better. So we should have respect towards our past, as I said, to the history, and also towards the surrounding where the building will stand in. So the next point is very important. I called it speaking a language that everyone understands, and that is truly democratic. So when you look at that building, that's around 1890, right? Art Deco building, or Art Nouveau in French, right? So all these design elements in these buildings are new. It's like very new for the time, but still everyone understands it, right? When you look at that building, you know where's the entrance, the main door. You see the second floor is a kind of half floor, right? The mezzanine. You know where's the main floor, and you also understand the upper finish, so the kind of entablature of that building. But the upper finish is it's designed completely new, so it has a completely new worked out design, but still everyone understands the building because even when this building is totally innovative for the time, it follows this what I call timeless patterns of architecture. So as I mentioned before, like contemporary architects often wanted to educate the people, and I think it's not the job of an architect to ask questions or to educate. So we have to speak a language that everyone understands, and by that also like create like things that everyone likes and would consider as beautiful. And it's not that relative as 20th century people always want to say. So beauty is relative, but not that relative. It can be easily discovered in surveys. Also about architecture and architectural design. So in the second part, I will work out what these timeless elements of architecture are, similar to the grammar or the vocabulary of a language. The first point I call being definite instead of ambiguous. So I subtitle it with providing beginning, middle, and end in both horizontal and vertical dimension. And first I wanted to title it like thinking in closed systems instead of indefinite ones. So what do I mean? When we look at that building from Schinkel in the west of Hamburg, I mean, everyone understands what's going on, right? So when we stand in front of a building, we have the horizontal and the vertical dimension of the facade. So the third dimension would be the floor plans, right? But in the two dimensions of a facade, so when we're in front of it, we have the vertical dimension. So that's here what we see as the base, the main body, and the upper closing of the house, which are definite and give like definite answers what's going on. And we have the horizontal direction, so where the building clearly says where it starts, where it's the middle, and where it ends. So by that it speaks like a clear language and let's say a sentence that everyone can understand. So by that the building is understood by everyone. And when like people look at the building, they will try to orientate in the facade, and it's a bit like writing subconsciously a text in the head about the facade. So by these following elements that I mentioned in this chapter, these elements gives the people who look at the building a lot help to write this text about the facade, to understand the building and the facade like in their head. The first important thing is like thinking in hierarchies. So when we look at this painting, it's again like a building in Hamburg, and it's partly hidden by the trees, right? That's why I put it here. But still the eye will like complete the building because it can understand it, although just some parts of it are visible. So the center, first of all, the eye will start its visual journey, so that's a good phrase to put it, in the center of the building. In this case, it's also a risalit. And it's like pushed out with these first three axes in the center, right? But still, it doesn't even have to be a risalit, but still in this case it is. So still the center clearly says I'm the center of the building. So this is the point where the viewer will look at first and can start its visual journey. So the center says clearly I'm the most important part, and it also has the biggest roof on top, right? And then the eye will wander to the corners, and although we can just see the left corner on the side, we will automatically complete the building, and the corners say I am a corner. So this is a definite statement, right? So we can write this in, let's say, the text in our head that will be written subconsciously while the eye look at the building. So that means a person can understand it. So modern architecture want to be often like endless and indefinite and have just a plain wall as a facade with holes in it, or maybe even without holes. So and by grouping these elements, and in this case putting them into hierarchies, the eye can understand it. So first is the center, and the second, it's hierarchy level B, are these sides. They also have the second largest roof, right? And then these other window axes, I think there are 4 or 5, filling the gap between the center, element A, and the corners, element B. They say, okay, I'm element C, the third hierarchy level. I'm just filling the gap. So they have the tertiary, they have the least important element. So that means the elements of the facade in this building are grouped, and these groups are put into hierarchies. Yeah, grouping elements is the more abstract level. I put this here at point 3. So when you look at that chateau in France, this is kind of related to hierarchies, but it's still something else. Because as I said, modern architecture often wanted to, I don't know, just row things like endlessly in both directions, vertical and horizontally, and create something like incountable. But by grouping elements, you address them clearly again. Here it's also very clear in this building, but you don't need to make it so obvious. But like if you group elements, you put them in a group, and the group says, I'm another group than the other group. So by this, you address them specifically, and the eye can understand it. And by that also like write in this meta text that it like every viewer writes automatically in their brain. And by this making it addressable and definite. So it's unambiguous. So, and then I wrote here optional symmetry. So this is a contemporary new building, right? But it's so extremely symmetrical, that's why I put it there. So about classical architecture, people often talk about like proportions and timeless materials, which are also important. But then they often talk about like symmetry and ornament. And I think symmetry and ornament are both chapters in this part of this video, but they are like, I think, both optional. So you can create a symmetrical facade, but you don't even have to. So when you follow that pattern of like grouping and sorting elements into hierarchies, or sorting those groups into hierarchies, then the eye will automatically be able to understand the building already. So when you, for example, imagine like classicistic building from United States around like 1800 or 1800 something, they are very often not symmetrical. I don't know why. I mean, American people often build asymmetric buildings. I don't know why, but still they're like classicistic, and also the eye can understand it because like parts of the building, and especially the facade, are grouped and then sorted into hierarchies. So when you follow that, you can make the building symmetrical, but you don't have to. But more important are axes. So axes exist both in the facade and also in the floor plan, so in several dimensions. And when you look at that building again in Hamburg, the same as before, I marked here the first axis is the center, right? In this case, the building is also symmetrical, but the center gives, as I said before, the eye a starting point for its journey. And here's also the entrance, so that means it's the most important element of the facade is the entrance, right? So this axis gives the eye a clear orientation and a clear starting point for the visual journey. And then the eye will jump to the corner axis and understand, okay, this is the last one. It's also like a singular axis. So it's like another group, right? The center, it's not even a risalit here. It's even like slightly pushed back, like a few centimeters compared to the corner of the buildings. But still the side axis is like another group. So it says like, I'm the side, and the other 3 axes say clearly, I'm the center. And last but not least, we have these 5 axes of the facade, which provides the face of the building. And as you see, these windows are also sorted in a hierarchy, right? The largest on the top, and then they become smaller. So by that, every group of 3 windows creates an axis, right? And in the floor plan, axes are also important. So when you look at that contemporary art museum in Hamburg from Ungers, it's a square on the first view, but you will see the main axis is actually the horizontal axis, and they're crossed by vertical axes. So we have always like main axes and then also hierarchies of axes. I think it becomes very clear when we look at that famous The Mall, so the core of Washington. So the main axis is clearly the horizontal one, right? The most important. And then there's hierarchy level B, so the vertical axis that crosses that first axis and creates the center point. But then we also have a third level of axes, these diagonal ones, and even a fourth level of axis, which creates this small grid of small streets. So we have a hierarchy of axes, and these axes are able to sort the whole area. And I really understood how axes in the classical architecture are able to organize when I saw this floor plan in the 19th century architecture book. So I marked these axes here in red. I hope you can see it. So this floor plan is particular because it organizes a classical building in this quite messy or unrectangular plot, right? So when we start on the bottom in this forecourt, the entrance is on the right side, right? And it's open the first axis through this like corridor and then this pre-chambre to the main court. So the large area in the center is a courtyard, right? But then there's a second axis on the right side, opening on the right side of the first axis and defining the center of this courtyard. So this is a second axis, parallel. And then because we want to go leftwards, because of this irregular plot, there's a small diagonal axis starting from that courtyard and leading through this roundish room, right? And so we turn like leftwards, look like 40 degrees or something diagonal. And then there's the fourth axis opening from that. So that's kind of the final axis that leads out into the garden. And on the other hand, from this roundish room backwards through a small enfilade, like 2 rooms, then into a staircase. So this is, I think, a very good example how axes are able to organize a space. And then I wrote again optional risalites, because risalites are also a thing that are often like recognized in classical architecture, but I think they're not really necessary. So I wrote optional, right? So this building is in Zurich. I studied at the ETH in Zurich, and I often walked by this building and thought about it, and I kind of like it. So it's the Zunfthaus zur Meisen. Don't ask me what Zunfthaus is in English. And it's strictly a Baroque building, but it has a quite pure, already classicistic facade, just this like large roof, and the decoration is Baroque, right? But it's from 18th century, so from Baroque times. And I think the architects managed to to include like all classical buildings in this facade, although it's not very long compared to it has like 11 axes, so everything looks a bit squeezed, but they could manage like also to include like 3 risalites, so that means these small stepping out of the facade. And here, since the facade is so flat and at the river, right, the Limmat in Zurich, these risalites push out just like 10 or 15 centimeters, so not very deep, but still they're able to A, create groups, and B, create hierarchies, what I mentioned before, by pushing out. So groups and hierarchies would be possible without risalites, but as I said, risalites I think are a very good way to structure a facade and gives again the eye orientation and to makes it more clear to read those groups and hierarchies. The next point I call the timeless grammar of the vertical sequence. So that's indeed very important. And I wrote here providing beginning, middle, and end in the vertical dimension. So before I talked about these 3 elements already, where we have to provide beginning, middle, and end in both horizontal and vertical directions, right? So when we look at that very small building in Louveciennes, it's a quite small, only 1-story building, right? But still it includes all these elements, what I call the timeless grammar in the vertical direction. So before I mentioned already, a building should provide a definite answer and a definite statement about like the horizontal and the vertical sequence. So this part is now about the vertical sequence. So what is that? I mean, every building starts like with a base, right? In this case, the base is quite low. It's just like 80 or 90 centimeters maybe, but it still says here I'm standing on the ground. So this is the beginning of the journey in the vertical direction. So every sentence also has a start, a main part and an end, right? Or every music piece, like every symphony, and has a beginning part, a main part, and an end. So the main part in this case is this one floor that exists, this one story. That's also indicated by the height of the columns. And then we always have this upper closing. So that clearly says, okay, here's the end of the building. That consists in most of the cases either of a roof or in this case here of an entablature and this balustrade. So this clearly indicates here's the end of the building. and everyone understands it, right? And sometimes like modern architecture wanted to say the buildings fly. I mean, no building ever flied, you know, every building stands on the ground. And on the other hand, modernism has this thing about like being so honest. But I mean, buildings who stand on the ground and look like they're flying, I think they're basically lying, right, on the moral stance. So if you want to judge buildings morally, as like early modern architects always wanted or stated, then those buildings lie, right? And they're also not, by the way, like fluid or moving, as like some like Zaha Hadid's architects would say. They say it's organic and it looks like it's moving. I mean, no building has ever moved, you know, they're like standing solid on the ground. So I think by using this like vertical sequence, you clearly show and say, okay, this building stands on the ground. So I think every building needs the space like where it stands on. And then it has this main part, as I said, as a main part of a sentence or a music piece. And this upper closure that, as I said, clearly says this is the end of the building. And there it is, the upper finish. So the next part is when you look at this like beautiful, very pure pavilion of Schinkel in Berlin. It's next to the Castle Charlottenburg in Berlin. It has a very pure and simple entablature, right? But yet this entablature is quite massive. So I think it's so massive because it has to compete with this balcony and that indicates the floor of the second floor, right? So still this like very purely designed, but still like very quite strongly worked out entablature, as clearly says this is the end of the building, right? And where we had this balustrade here on top of the pavilion in Louveciennes, we have here just like a closed wall that continues, but it looks like it stands on top of this entablature. So this gives this kind of heavy closing of the building, and it clearly says, so this is the end of the sentence. This is the end of the building in the vertical direction. And then the clear to find entrance. I mean, so I put this beautiful Egyptian temple here. As I said, I love Egyptian architecture. So this is basically just the entrance, right? It's a bit ironic, and that I even have to mention this chapter here, because like it should be so obvious that the entrance is the most important element of the facade. So this obviously it's the function to go in. So it is a basic function that this entrance is like easy to find, and it's literally the address of the building. So it's the main element of the face of the building, and it should be worked out like specially and like having an important role in the design of the facade. But somehow modern architecture and still like contemporary architects, they often design it as a slit, like horizontal or vertical slit. So I kind of slip in the building as I kind of underline like in the post box. But I mean, as I said, an entrance, I think it has to be an important element. It has to be worked out and stand out to, literally give the address of the building. And the next I called physicality of the building. So when we look at that quite average apartment house in Hamburg, it's not great and not standing out, right? Quite mediocre. But on the other hand, it has a physicality. So I think the main thing is to use like massive materials as like stones or bricks and cover it with like plaster or nature stone. And then by that, the building, you see it already like having a body, right? And then we cut basically the windows and the openings as holes into the wall. So in Germany, we call that Lochfassade. I think in English, it's something like perforated facade. So that means like you cut the openings in this body of the house. So by that, it keeps its physicality, and it's not like just like a steel and glass grid that's like blowing in the wind. So it should have this like strength of physicality that displays like duration, right, and stability. And then the ornament. So here I wrote again like optional. And yet when people talk about like pre-modern architecture, they often like mention the ornament. So why the heck did I put this building here to explain ornament? Because it's a very pure, and again like early classicism around 1800, building from Christian Friedrich Hansen again. It's like a very small town hall as administrative building in a suburb in northern Germany. So the entablature is worked out very pure, and even like too pure maybe. So it's a very reduced form of classicism. So why do I put that here to explain ornament? Because there is ornament, and in this case all this ornament have a function. That's why I put that building here as an example. So the first ornament is this frame around the door. I mean, it's not functionally needed, but on the other hand, it makes this door, as I said before, this important element, and gives the address of the building. So the frame around the door indicates that this is the most important element, as I said, of the facade. And then we have also frames around these windows at the corner of this building. and they are also not like necessarily functionally needed. And if you see the other two windows next to the door, they do not have a frame. So what does this frame do? As I said, this frame is a decoration, right? It's not needed. And this decoration has a function because on the one hand, it indicates that the windows on the side are more important than the smaller windows next to the door. So it indicates, tada, groups and hierarchies, and by this edicula on top, in this case also an axis, a vertical axis. And this decoration has the function to say these windows are more important than the other windows. And also this frame connects these windows on the side with the door in the center. So it creates these three vertical axes. So these two windows on the side and the window in the center are the three main vertical axes of this facade. Axes, we heard about that before, right? And also the balustrade under the window, I mean, it's in front of a closed wall, right? You cannot look even through. And by that, it's a decorative element too. It's not functionally necessarily needed. But on the other hand, this balustrade under the window has a function again, because it makes this window look like higher as the door. And by that connects these windows with the door. So it makes it look like these windows reach the base of the building, right? And by that connect it like visually with the door. So also this balustrade has a function, right? So all the ornament in this building has a function. So, and then tectonics, I mean, it's a bit difficult thing what it is, and I think I will make another video about that. But tectonics is basically the idea that the facade of a building displays the forces that indeed work in that wall or in the facade behind it. So that means that's especially important nowadays when, like in cold regions like Northern Europe or Northern America, we have to insert the insulation between the outer facade, like plaster or natural stone, and the construction facade. So there's another layer of insulation in between, but tectonics is kind of the theoretical background. Yeah, as I said, I will make another video about that, but architecture should have that in the back mind, that I think tectonics are important in this new form of architecture, to see the facade as displaying the forces that, as I said, indeed work in that building. And then harmonic proportions. Again, it's like so obvious that I should not even have to mention it. So when we look at that building of Palladio again at the public square, it's like perceived as quite beautiful for many people that time and also nowadays. So, and as I said before, a building should not interrupt or ask questions or challenge the viewer with like difficult riddles or something to think about himself or the world. So a building has to serve purpose and has to give answers. So by that, as I said before, it has to be harmonic, and there's like a whole science about which proportions are harmonic and beautiful. And I think we should just like keep on the proportions that are perceived as beautiful and harmonic by nearly all of the people, let's say most of the people, and should not like, as I said, try to be a disruptive force or like pulling the whole attention of the city on us as the building. So we should not, as I said before, be egomaniac. We should just like, follow the certain patterns about like aesthetical design, and that also includes like, as I said, timeless proportions, and they are in hundreds of books, so it's quite clear what that is. We should just like use them. And then solid materials, that's a bit related to the point of physicality. So I think a building should not, as I said, be flying in the wind. So if we use basically like stone and bricks and plaster and natural stone, we automatically be able to create a building that expresses duration and like stability. And related to that also, it's like ridiculous that I have to mention it as well, timeless and non-fashionable colors. So this is again a building in Rome, right, in natural stone. And natural stone is often like, it has quite unsaturated colors, so it's often like timeless and pleasing the eye. So I think, I mean, there are some contemporary architecture office like Sauerbruch-Hatten, for example, they're so proud of using like contemporary colors. But again, like what does contemporary mean? They're like fashion now, like for 5 years, but in 10 or 15 years, nobody want to see them again. So I think like every color that an architect choose, same as the material, you should always ask yourself, is it still like fashion in 20, 30 or 40 years? So I come to the summary. I will use this building again, the Zunfthaus zur Meisen in Zurich, to conclude all the elements that I worked out before. And I mean, most of these buildings that I've shown include all or most of these, what I call timeless elements of architecture. But as I said before, it's not necessary that all are included. But I mean, this building in Zurich, like quite ideally includes all. That's why I take it as an example. So I will show all these elements in this practical example so you can clearly understand what I mean. And as I said, it's kind of my interpretation what these timeless elements of architecture are, like a grammar of a language. And you feel free in the comments to write your own ideas about what these elements are or criticize some. Maybe I'm wrong with some. So first of all, this building is definite, right? It has a very clear beginning in both horizontal and vertical dimension of the facade. So it says like here I begin and here I end in both directions. Furthermore, it's organized in groups. So in this case, the groups are also risalites, and they even marked with these pilasters on the wall, but both is not necessarily needed. So working in groups and then in hierarchies, so the groups are then sorted in hierarchies, is the more crucial thing. So first of all, we have the first group in the center, right? These first three center axes. And also in addition, we have this large balcony there on the beginning of the second floor. And also this window of this balcony or window door that leads out to that balcony probably is worked out differently than the other windows. So it has a different size and shape, or mainly a different shape than the other windows. So it clearly says I'm the most important element. So by this, the eye automatically starts its visual journey by looking on that balcony and then this window door. So it clearly says I'm the most important element in that facade. This is the main address of this facade. And here the eye can start its journey, as I said. So it stands out, and this is, as I said, part of this first group of the center risalit that also says I'm the most important element. And then the eye can wander to the corners, because like modern architecture would just have put the 4 windows on each side of the center. So 8 windows on each floor, right? Left and right of the center, just in a plain facade. But by making the outer 2 window axes a group, in this case, as I said, it's also risalit, but that would not even be necessary or needed. By making these 2 outer window axes on both sides a group, they can be read separately and the eye can orientate easier on the facade. So from the center where we began our journey, we jump to the side and clearly can define, okay, this is the end of the building. And then the other 2 window axes kind of are filled in, right? So they are the tertiary level, the least important level. Yeah, and by that, as I said already, they're creating hierarchy. So the element in the center is the most important element, hierarchy A. And then the sides are kind of hierarchy B. And as I said before, these other window axes, they are kind of filling the gap a bit, and they're hierarchy level C. And then the center, as I said before, it gives a clear orientation. So it says I'm the middle of the building, and that's also where the door under the balcony is located, right? And this building is also fully symmetrical. So this would not even be necessary. So you could push one of the outer corners like 1 or 2 axes further out and kind of include 1, 2 or 3 more window axes in the C part on one of the side, only one of the side, to make this building asymmetrical. But because of this grouping of the elements and then sorting these groups into hierarchies, the eye would still read the building as symmetrical even if it is not. So remembering these American countryside houses from around 1800, they are often asymmetrical. But in this case, the facade is even symmetrical. And also each element in itself is also symmetrical. And furthermore, as I mentioned before, also the elements within the facade are grouped in hierarchies. So the window in the center clearly says I'm the most important window. And then the other 4 windows on each side of the center in each floor have the second hierarchy, right? So they are larger. And then the small windows next to the center window would be hierarchy level C or 3. So even the single elements in the facade are also sorted in a hierarchy. And then the vertical sequence that's displayed here quite ideally. So the main body part is part B, right? The upper 2 floors. And it stands on this base, element A, which is also worked out with these arc windows where the window itself is a bit deeper in the facade, so it creates a darker shadow. So the main body of the house, element B, stands on its base, element A. And element C is a clear closing of the building and entablature. And in this case, the building has also this large roof on top, element D, which gives it this Baroque appearance. And I put a classical column on the right side next to it. I hope you can see it. Here it's black on white. So this is from an architecture theory book, like the ideal proportion of a column. And as you can see, this building fits it quite nearly ideally. So the body part B with the risalids is also indicated with the pilasters, right? Here it's not even full column, so the whole facade doesn't even have one column, but it has these pilasters, and they, as you can see, have the height of the column, and the entablature C of the building matches quite exactly the entablature height of the ideal column system from the architectural theory book, right? So B has the proportion to C as the column on the right side has. And the base A is made a bit higher in this case, but that actually doesn't have to be exactly like in the theory books. And obviously to fit the whole first floor in, right? But as you can see, it works. So to summarize, I mean, this video I wanted to show what I call these timeless elements of architecture, and feel free to add more in the comments if you have other ideas or criticize me when I'm wrong. So that's my own interpretation of what I call these like timeless grammar of the architectural language. And I think if we focus on that and learn this grammar of the language again and combine this like timeless elements that were there in the pre-modern architecture throughout all styles, if we can combine that with the advantages of modern architecture, I think we can create like a new and timeless way of architecture.